Hey guys, it's Bella, and in this video I want to talk to you about calligraphic Gothic script, and this is a script that was written between the 1200s and the 1500s. For those of you in Gutwix, please note that this is not in fact in any direct relation to the Ostrogoths or the Visigoths. The reason this name is applied is because an Italian art historian wanted to disparage the architectural style which developed in this time because it differed from the Romanesque architecture preceding it and the Renaissance architecture succeeding it. So he described this as Gothic in order to tie it to the barbarian Germanic tribes, and because of this association his work was quite famous over time, and so the term is applied to things not only in architecture but also in art and in writing, including script. And it's a script that will be familiar to quite a few people because it's still often used to this day in logos, especially of newspapers, which is why I have some on the screen. And as I mentioned last week, you can use the paleography of Gothic manuscript books by Albert Derelez if you want a bit more information about these very fascinating manuscripts. And before we dive into this, it's important that we talk about litera pre-Gothica or Proto-Gothic script. And Proto-Gothic script refers to the gradual developments between the well-defined Carolingian script of the 9th century and the emergence of Gothic scripts in the 13th century. And in this period, script slowly started to take on some of the later Gothic characteristics. These characteristics included lozenge-like ends on minim strokes and descenders. Sometimes you would have very small serifs forming on descenders. You would have a flat-topped uncial D becoming more common than the tall-backed D. You would have generally thicker quills being used, which would lead to quite thick wedges, and you would have a greater tendency to form curved letters from straighter strokes, and you would have a heavier use of abbreviations and sigla, especially in certain kinds of texts, such as scientific and legal documents, and you'd also see a more common differentiation of U and V and W, because these are letters useful for writing vernacular names, which are increasingly entering into Latin documents. Here is an example of Proto-Gothic script. Do forgive me for including the bottom bit. That was an error on my part, and it says Sanctorum omnis novites tamenti fide in the top in uncial, and then it goes Lissimus dispensator in quo loquitur Christus sancte pater sediciane ut exemplo suo credendum sibi facile persuadeat operum bonorum curvam maximum gerit, et quicquid alis faciendum dicit, ipse primitus facit sine. So this is actually quite an early form of Proto-Gothic. There's not that many Gothic characteristics. You can notice on the N's and the I's there are the beginnings of serifs developing, and in the shapes of the A and the N and the M's we can see the tendency to use straight strokes and hairlines to form curved letters rather than rounded strokes. And we see we see some abbreviations, not too many on maximum and bonorum, mostly just nomen sacra in this one. We have persuadeat as well. We have not too many Gothic features left yet in this particular example. But now we should talk about some history for context, and that is universities. So in the mid-13th century, the University of Oxford was founded, and Cambridge would be opened about a century later. These institutions, which had even earlier precedents on the continent, were a conceptual import from the Arab world, and they constituted the first places where secular scholarship, especially in areas of Roman law, rhetoric, and natural science, were flourishing, because after the Crusades, people were finding these texts in former Moorish Spain, and they had scholars who were bilingual in Arabic and Latin who were able to translate these texts from the Arabic translations into Latin when they could then be brought to the rest of the Western world, because the Arabic world had preserved in translation works of ancient Greek scholarship which had long been forgotten in the Christian West. And so the Crusades brought about a sort of a mini renaissance in learning, and this led to the Islamic concept of the university being brought over into Western Europe, and especially in the 13th century the oldest universities were founded. These universities would build up quite dedicated libraries whose books would often be chained to reading posts in order to prevent theft, because remember, books are incredibly valuable in this time. and they would contain these things called anathema, which are sort of curses. And it was these educational requirements which promoted the prose format and the mass production of certain kinds of textbooks, especially what are known as florilegia, or sort of bundles of knowledge. And here's a picture of All Souls College, Oxford. Very pretty city, Oxford. I highly recommend keen medievalists check it out. It's wonderful. So now let's get on to talk about Litera Gothica Textualis, or Gothic script. So, Litera Gothica Textualis, or Calligraphic Gothic script, is a minuscule script which developed its proper form in the 13th century. It would go on to be the first script used in printing, actually, most famously by the Gutenberg press. Its distinguishing features include H, M, and N have a slight left-leaning descender, and you have a cross-shaped biting T. You don't get a biting T, so that the T up until the Gothic period does not intersect, does not form a sort of cross shape, like a plus shape. It actually looks a lot more like the capital T that I've put at the end of that sentence there. And in the Gothic era, that line starts to drop a little, and that's called a biting T. You have in Gothic script the use of a thicker nib and the formation of curved letters with short vertical strokes, especially minims, and this leads to a lot of confusion, because if you think about it, if you're writing your I's, your M, your N, and a lot of other letters using minims, sometimes even E's will be written with minims, and U's, this can make it really hard to tell letters apart. And this was something the scribes even at the time struggled with. They had much more developed system of punctuation, including dotting their I's. They would use full stops and commas quite consistently. There was frequent abbreviation and biting of vowels with adjacent consonants, as we'll see in some examples, and more frequent use of the majuscule curved S than the tall S, which is used in Carolingian and Proto-Gothic. And they started to differentiate between I and J much more commonly, and as well as differentiating between U, V, and W. They would use pencil line marking rather than scoring. So previous manuscripts, they would leave an indentation on the page to mark the lines in which one would write. But in the Gothic era, they started to actually draw those onto the page using pencil, and this is an important development. Here are the letter forms themselves. So you'll notice that the appearance is quite squashed. It's almost like unseal in that the descenders are actually quite small. So look on the P, the Q, the J, and the D and the B as well. And the H, their ascenders are quite small. Look on the H, we have the descender that curves to the left just a little bit. We have both forms of the S, the tall and the rounded one, although the rounded one becomes more common. Towards the bottom right hand side of the second line, we have differentiation between a U, a V, a W, X, Y, U, V, and W, and then we also have the X, the Y, and the Z. We have the biting T in the second line as well. And at the very bottom of the page, we can actually see some biting letters. So that's D, E, O, R, and then P, O, etc. Here is an example, and it's actually from a printed book. This isn't a manuscript. This is a early printed version of the Canterbury Tales, and I will read it out to you. Forgive the relatively poor image quality. And also forgive my Middle English pronunciation. I'm not amazing at Middle English. So it says, Whilom there was dwelling in Oxenford a rich young dwarf that was guested harder to board, and of his craft was he a carpenter. With him there was a poor scholar, had learned art, but all his fantasy was turned to learn astrology, and could ascertain of conscience to domain by interrogations, if that men asked him certain words, whether they should have draught or shores, or if that men asked him what should befall, of everything he may not reckon all. So that's my bad attempt at reading Middle English, but there you go. Here is another example, and this is one of my favourite medieval texts. It's a text that I, back when I was first learning medieval Latin, I studied this on Bartholomew's World website. It's brilliant. So it is Bartholomew the Englishman's De Proprietatibus Rerum, so on the properties of things. It's just like an encyclopedia, and he sort of talks about the properties of all things in the world. And Wait, is this one? No, I'm wrong. Sorry, it borrows from the same text. No, this is just a bestiary, one of the early medieval bestiaries. A really beautiful one, and if you're willing to pay like a few £100, you can buy a private facsimile of it. Beautiful manuscript. But anyway, it's in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and this is really classically Gothic script. You can notice the pencil margins that are drawn out on the page rather than scored. This really beautiful decorated Lombard capital D. We can see, do we have any curved S's in this one? Yes, so in line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in line 5, pe ab speluncis, that last S, and then abstractus, the second S in that one, is curved. We see a lot of abbreviation throughout this one. We can see the H with descender curling leftwards a bit. In the 1, 2, 3, fourth line, fourth word, Latinum, we can see the I is being dotted, although note that in some Gothic manuscripts the dotting of I's isn't consistent, and even in this one as well. So in the second line we don't have any I's that are dotted, but in the first we have some of them. So it's not always consistent, but it's something to look out for. At the bottom of the fourth line, actually, we actually have a hyphen, which is another feature that comes in the Gothic era. Qui se and then hyphen pe, because sepe is a single word. So I will read this out to you now, so you get a sense of it. From the beginning. Draco maior cunctorem serpentium sive omnium animantium super terra. Hunc Greci dracontam vocant, unde et derivatum est in Latinum, ut Draco diceretur. Qui sepe ab speluncis abstractus fertur in erem, concitatur que propter eum est autem Christatus ore parvo, et artis fistulis per quas trahit spiritum et linguam exelit, vim autem non indentibus suis. And then it continues. So this is the dragon is the largest of all serpents, or all animals on the earth. This animal the Greeks call the draconta, whence the name is derived in Latin, so that it should be called dragon or draco. And this animal, often drawn out from its caves, is borne into the air, drawn up on account of its own wind. However, and truly, I don't know what this word Christatus is. It might be scaled, Christatus, but I'm not certain on that. Or they parvo, with a small mouth, et artis fistulis. And to be honest, I'm not fully sure what that means, artis fistulis. I'd have to look it up. Per quas trahit, through which it draws out the ghost and sort of flickers its tongue. So I think fistules might be lips or teeth. Yeah, artis fistules might refer to like sharp fangs through which it draws its breath and nostrils. Yes, nostrils. Sorry. Yes, with a small mouth and narrow nostrils, I believe, through which it draws breath and sort of its tongue, I believe, can exit. However, its strength is not in its teeth. And then the passage gets cut off. Here's another one from the start of John Mandeville's Tales, and this goes to show you the variety you can get within Gothic script. This is a much more italic one, in the sense that it leans to one side. It's a bit more difficult to read. It's not as clear. This one actually has some of the palm tree, like the ascenders split off a little bit at the top, like in secretary script, and the lozenge endings at the bottom of words are much more clearly defined, like at the bottom of minims. And we see quite heavy abbreviation as well here. If I read it out, it'll say, for as much as the Lond with the say, that is to say in the Holy Lond, that men call the Lond of behest. Among alle other Londes it is most worthy, lady and sovereign of all other Londes, for 'tis blessed und Hamed, und sacred of the precious blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Use which Lord it leaketh him to taking such in blood of the Virgin Mary unto, goodness, this is how hard it can be. Very last line in the middle I'm struggling with. Emveru that Lund with his holy faith. I'm not certain of one of the words in the middle, but there you go. That's some Middle English pronounced very badly. Here is another one, and it's quite a cool text. I won't go into this too much. This is a relatively curved example. It looks almost proto-Gothic actually, but we have most of the Gothic features quite clearly coming in here. We have a thicker nib, we have very heavy abbreviation. This is a computistical text which is quite commonly abbreviated. We have the curled S used quite frequently. We have the very clear sharp lozenges at the end of minims, etc. And this is actually a spell where you sort of add up the name of a person, which has a numerical value, and the number of the moon on which they die. You divide it by 30, and then you look for the remainder number in this sphere. And if it's in the top half of the sphere, the person is going to live, and if it's in the bottom half, they're going to die of whatever illness they currently have. So right here, you've got a bit of medieval magic, basically, which I quite love. It's worth talking briefly about Gothic art, architecture, and manuscript illumination because, like I said, it coincides, the Gothic script, with an artistic movement as well. In architecture, engineering breakthroughs enabled people to build these vaulted arches, and this lets a lot more light into the churches, and it encouraged the proliferation of art styles which exploited that luminescence, such as stained glass windows. And many of these survive to this day because they're, somewhat more recent. If you're living in Europe, you probably have a Gothic church or cathedral quite near to you. In art, Byzantine influences led to more naturalistic depictions of the human body than they had in previous centuries, and they would use the draping of clothing to show the shape of a human body. Interestingly, the depiction of Christ himself was humanized, and they would come to emphasize his suffering rather than the stoic acceptance of suffering that he has in earlier depictions. And lastly, manuscript illumination became much more common and better developed as artistic conventions were trained better and the market for private collections developed as well. And it's in these manuscript illuminations that we see the very beginning of landscape painting. These are two pictures from one of my absolute favourite Gothic books. It's actually a translation of an Arabic work by an Arabic author whose name I'm now forgetting, but in Latin it's called the Tarquinum Sanitatis, and it's basically a sort of encyclopedia of all sorts of things you'll encounter in daily life, with advice on whether or not they are in fact good for your health, what time of day you should eat certain foods, etc., and how they affect the bodily humours. And it includes something like exercises such as these two men here fighting with sword and buckler. And it's really charming because they would make many illuminated copies, like with the drawings and in this Gothic style, and these drawings would give you little ordinary scenes in medieval life. So you get to see medieval interiors, like the insides of homes, and people doing really ordinary things like sitting by the fire, having some wine, playing a game, working. All of it. It's amazing fun. I highly recommend anyone just Google Tarquinum Sanitatis and you won't be disappointed. Here are, because it's quite dear to my heart, the logo and the seal of the University of Oxford. The seal, I believe, actually is medieval, and you can see the Gothic script used on the seal. And you've got the Chancellor depicted there, and his students, and the Oxford City logo below. Here is a picture of Merton College, where J.R. Tolkien taught. I believe that was the last place that he taught at in Oxford. Very exciting stuff, very much worth a visit. And you see this college quite a bit in the movie Tolkien, which I'm quite a big fan of as well. Here is a medieval meme which is designed to make fun of how hard Gothic is to read, and it's also a tongue twister. So if I read it out, it says Mimi numinum nivium minimin Munimium vinimuniminum invinuivivi minimum volunt, which frankly it's very difficult, but it's something to the effect of like the imitators of the gods desire too much wine, but there's a bunch of other sort of there's a bunch of adjectives that go in the wine, and I can't pass it out right now. I'm a bit too tired. But despite it being quite a blurry image, you can see how literally on the page it just looks like a bunch of eyes, and then the occasional U, and then you got an O in the middle and an L. Like, there you go. Like, that breaks the monotony. And medieval scribes would like write these out to sort of demonstrate how difficult the script could be at times to read. Although this is a very extreme example. Most Latin sentences don't have this many minims in them, so normally you can just identify a word from the context, even if it might look like you could have two different readings. It's worth talking briefly about Middle English, Arabic numerals, and new letters that come in the Gothic period. We basically don't have any English written after the conquest during the Proto-Gothic era for about a century, and then after that century it re-emerges as Middle English with a lot of imported French vocabulary and a much simpler grammar. It sounds quite different to Old English, and it uses a few different letters which have a rather loose orthography because there's no written standard for writing it, and they employed a new letter alongside imported Arabic numerals, although note that Arabic numerals don't become the standard until 1500s, 1600s. Like they coexist with Roman numerals for quite a long time, but if you have Arabic numerals coming in, that this tells you that it's like 1300s, 1400s or later. The Yo letter, which is pronounced a in Middle English, it had the phonetic values of a J, a Y, and a Y, but it could also be used as an abbreviation for inflected endings in Latin texts. You might remember seeing it in your in the Carolingian episode where we looked at all of the Latin abbreviations that developed in this time. However, in continental vernacular languages, it had other values. So in medieval Italian, you can transcribe it, for instance, as the letter Z. And note that the abbreviated form of the letter thorn and the letter Y look almost identical in Gothic script. And this results that most of what looks like a Y, especially if it has a line through it, it actually represents a TH sound. And this is why we have the anachronism ye olde whatever. It's actually meant to be written and pronounced the old, because it's a thorn that they're drawing. It just happens to look very similar to a letter Y. So this brings us to the end. Here are some nice formal Gothic manuscripts. I'll read out this one for you in Middle English, and then we call it a day. So, oh goodness. Here is the prologue and beginning, the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, that is, God is love, and the Word was at God, and God was the Word. This was at the beginning at God, alle thing. It's been made by Him, and without, and then it drops off. Start of Gawain and the Green Knight. Start of the Canterbury Tales. All sorts of exciting manuscripts for you to do. So, until next time, thank you guys for watching and have a good day. Bye!